Hello everyone, my name is Juan Ruiz, and today my presentation is going to be on invasive species on Catalina Island. Now, most of us are from California, so I'm sure Catalina Island needs no introduction. However, I'm sure a lot of us aren't familiar with a lot of the island's more intricate details. So, Santa Catalina Island is one of California's Channel Islands, and it lies just 22 miles southwest of Los Angeles. The island itself is estimated to be about 194 kilometers squared, and its highest point is 2,097 feet. Now, when we're talking about invasive species, using an island as an example actually has a lot of benefits. One of the first being is that when settlers first arrived on the island in the 1900s, we had a very good detailed inventory as to what kind of plants and animals could already be found on the island. And more importantly, in this modern day where plants are some of the most deadly invasive species that can cause tons of damage to ecosystems, there's not really a lot of points for these invasions to happen outside of the island's two main communities, which in and of themselves are rather small. So monitoring what kinds of plants and animals can come to the island is rather easy considering the island's size and its relatively small communities. Going forward, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the definition, but just to clarify, for the sake of this presentation, an invasive species is an organism that is not native to the place where found and tends to grow and spread easily, usually to the detriment of native species. When we're talking about conservancy on the island, we can't forget to mention the Catalina Island Conservancy. This organization is dedicated to conserving and restoring Catalina Island's endemic species, including plants and animals. And a lot of the situations we're going to be talking about in this presentation, in some way, shape, or form, can be traced back to the people working at the Catalina Island Conservancy. Now, this organization affiliates with local government, but they themselves are not a government agency. They do, however, hold control over the various conservation projects that are happening on the island. Now, the Conservancy itself has successfully eradicated most of the large vertebrate from the island, of course, over decades. Some of their major success stories include feral hogs and wild goats, and a lot of the sort of minor rodents that have stemmed from the major city areas like Avalon. And we're going to be looking into one of their success stories, how they have successfully eradicated wild hogs, one of the more dangerous invasive species that plagues most of America's farmlands, how they were able to completely eradicate that from the island. Now, Catalina's feral hog population was originally believed to have been brought over from Santa Rosa Island for recreational hunting by early ranchers in the 1900s. Now, extensive studies on their detriment to the environment only really began in 1980, and an eradication program went underway in 1990 after it was very clear as to how much damage these feral hogs were doing to the environment. Now, a very skeleton version of the Catalina Island Conservancy took under this mission, and they operated under a divide and conquer kind of methodology into dealing with this invasive species. Essentially, the island was separated into 4 fenced zones, and one by one, the Conservancy and a very small amount of personnel employed different methods into pretty much trying to catch as many wild hogs as they possibly could. One of the most effective means of trapping these wild hogs was quite literally just trapping them with corral traps. In a sense, they would make just these large square corrals, place some bait, and just wait for large amounts of hogs to gather into the corral and then close it, and at a later time personnel would come over and collect the hogs. And this strategy was incredibly popular because, as I said, you were able to catch large amounts of wild hogs without having any personnel present. Now, of course, trapping only worked for such a large portion of the wild hogs in one of these zones, and of course, after a while, ground hunting using trained dogs and huntsmen would be deployed to each of the 4 zones to collect the remaining stragglers that were able to successfully avoid the traps. Now, before you are 2 graphs that were taken from the scientific paper which disclosed the methodologies in which the Conservancy was able to deal with the feral hog problem. Most of the zones followed the same kind of path that Zone 1 has here, where over the course of a couple years, the overall population of pigs greatly declined. The only outlier is Zone 4, which seemed to have some trouble kind of stabilizing their feral hog population, but after around 3 years, the population had reached 0. While the wild hogs are a success story that the Conservancy can add to its history, one of the more prevalent issues on the island are the invasive plants. And at the time of writing, there's over 80 currently known species of plant that the Catalina Island Conservancy has identified as invasive. And today, thousands of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent treating landscaping plants that have invaded the wildlands of the island. Roughly 35 total species have been controlled and removed from the island. Now, some of the more modern species of invasive plant that have begun to show themselves in recent years come from gardens or decorations that originally stem from the city of Avalon, which is the island's largest city. One of these plants is Genista linfolia, which we will be observing here in the coming slides. Now, Genista linfolia, or its more common name, Mediterranean broom, which is much more easier for me to pronounce, was originally native to southwestern Europe and North Africa, and is believed to escape from gardens in Avalon from people that were using it as decoration. This plant alone has spread to even the most remote locations on the island. Now, the Catalina Habitat Improvement and Restoration Program, or from here on CHIRP, deploys field teams to every inch of the island to collect data, and this data is then inserted into a Geographic Information System, or a GIS ArcMap. So with this highly detailed map, researchers can tell which environments the plant prefers and where on the island it's the most prevalent, so they can efficiently deploy teams to expedition there and get rid of it much more efficiently than just searching around blindly. The final and probably most interesting case of invasive species on the island has to be its herd of bison. Now, originally brought over by Zane Grey in his 1930 movie The Vanishing American, the movie originally only featured 15 bison for filming, but eventually the herd grew to over 400 by the 1960s. Now, it's around 1963 that the bison began to become too large for their own good, and it began to have severe repercussions on their habitat. And a culling program began in 1969, and today the Conservancy monitors the herd and keeps it to a size of just 150 to 200. Now, despite the bison's protected status, it still fits the definition of an invasive species. It certainly is not native to the island, and it's spread incredibly easy, most likely because there is simply no other mammal on the island that could possibly contend with them. On top of that, they are detrimental to themselves if it was not for the Conservancy. If it wasn't for the Conservancy keeping their population in check, they would most likely consume all the resources that were available to them. Now, if they are permitted to cull the herd due to its effects on the ecosystem, why not cull all of them like they did the feral hogs? And I believe there's some very interesting answers to this question. And those answers sort of speak for themselves here. The bison themselves have become a part of the island's identity, especially with its economy in the modern day being focused mainly on tourism. And if the bison populations are kept in check by the Conservancy and are heavily monitored, they really don't do not nearly as much damage as they once did. So this is a weird case in which the invasive species is itself sort of permitted to be on the island, despite its potential havoc that it could one day ensue. And with that, I thank you for listening to my discussion on invasive species in Catalina Island. Right here are the sources cited within the presentation, and of course, credits for the various images that were used within.